I have the impossible but also the delightful task of trying to sum up everything we've been doing since September. I'm not going to be able to talk about everything that's worth talking about, certainly not, but I hope that we can at least put a pin in our exploration this fall and just take stock of some of the ground that we've covered before we go into the winter. You all will either have already received or will soon receive news of our upcoming programming for January and February. And all I have to say is if you think it's been good so far, it's going to be even better in the spring. So I'm very excited about it. In 1985, the scholar of literature and mythology Joseph Campbell, well known to many of you, sat down with PBS's Bill Moyers and began recording a famous series of interviews that later were known as The Power of Myth. In one of these most famous exchanges, Moyers asked Campbell, "Do you ever have the sense of being helped by hidden hands?" It's a fabulous question. And Campbell responded, "All the time. It is miraculous. I even have a superstition that has grown on me as a result of invisible hands coming down all the time. Namely, that if you do follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting for you. And the life that you ought to be living is the one you are living. When you can see that, you begin to meet people who are in your field of bliss, and they open doors to you. I say, follow your bliss and do not be afraid, and doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be." It's really an extraordinary statement. Heard in one key, it attempts to take stock of the sense common, Campbell thought, to all of the world's great religions and myths, that bliss or rapture or joy is found through deep and individual spiritual transformation and discernment, and is in some way the secret to the discovery of those unique paths of transformation, custom built for each one of us, as it were. Heard in another key, though, it's a crucial moment in the emergence of a spirituality of self-realization, individual, private, practically solipsistic, that characterizes our secular society. Follow your bliss quickly becomes you do you. A phrase which is just as easily a way to keep the fragile peace at your family's Christmas dinner when politics comes up, right? As much as it is a way to acknowledge the dignity of the difference that you have with another person. You do you is not quite the compliment that we sometimes think it is. Follow your bliss, interpreted through you do you, issues in a portrait of the good life, one with which we as contemporary Americans living in the modern West are very familiar, and so I want to speak about it for a moment. It's a vision of the good life in which each of us individually, ideally by ourselves and alone, so we don't hurt anybody else, suss out whatever it is that we find fun. And then we do our very best to let other people find what they find fun and then pursue their fun as much as they can. It's heavily indebted as a spirituality to consumerism and to the consumer mindset, construing differences in the blisses that we find in our lives as tantamount to liking Coke rather than Pepsi. Most of us know that this isn't actually workable in the extreme, okay? You can't actually take it all the way. If someone finds their bliss in making fabulous gingerbread houses, but then smothering those gingerbread houses in ketchup, I might think that their sense of the culinary good life is off a little bit, right? But overall, that's pretty harmless, okay, putting ketchup on gingerbread, even though it is disgusting. But if someone finds their bliss in stalking an ex-girlfriend, or in making money through insanely exploitative financial schemes, follow your bliss as you do you just doesn't cut the mustard. You need something else in there to intervene. And this shows us two things, I think. First, that without some sort of non-secular, non-consumerist ground beneath it, you do you is really no more than that emergency measure we take at our holiday parties when conversation veers from snow patterns to how far behind we are in our Christmas shopping to potentially relationship-destroying territory like politics, sex, or religion, right? We just say, you do you, and then try and move on to the next course of things. That is, it's a coping mechanism we use to navigate a pluralistic society or even our pluralistic families. And that's useful, but it's not a vision of the good life. And sometimes we confuse the two. Second, it's very likely that our ability to discern what our bliss really is potentially compromised, or maybe even fatally compromised and untrustworthy. Of course, the gingerbread ketchup monstrosity seems incredibly disgusting to me, but it's, pretty harmless, as I said. But the bliss of the stalker is dangerous in an entirely different way. Some of the things that human beings find their bliss in are genuinely bad for them and bad for others. And not just because they impinge on the ability of, say, the person being stalked to pursue their own bliss unimpeded. Sometimes, influenced by the libertarianism and the Enlightenment philosophy behind the U.S. Constitution, we pretend that that's the only kinds of moral evils we can actually commit vis-a-vis one another. Namely, we could prevent somebody else from pursuing happiness with the same verve and freedom that we pursue our own happiness. Sure, that's a bare minimum legal standard, okay? Everybody should be free to pursue their happiness so long as it doesn't conflict with the pursuit of the happiness of others, the pursuits of happiness of others. But that's not a vision of what a good life or a good society really amounts to. It's just like the beginning of one such thing. Doubtless, Joseph Campbell himself would agree with many of the things I've just said. Okay, I'm not trying to say Joseph Campbell's to blame for all this. That he would agree with it in spite of some enduring differences that I have with Joseph Campbell, and I'm not going to talk about those because this isn't a lecture about him. But later in his life, actually, he bemoaned both the things I'm bemoaning right now. The culture of individualism, which gobbled up his follow your bliss, and the sense that bliss is just any old thing that happens to make me happy at any given moment. He's purported to have said, instead of follow your bliss, I should have said follow your blisters. Indeed. So why spend so much time talking about a commonly Instagrammed inspirational quote and railing against you do you? Because Fully Alive has been about following your bliss. That's what we've spent 4 months talking about, is how to follow your bliss. It's been about charting the Christian answer to where we find our bliss in the pursuit of the triune God through a life of Christ-likeness in the power of the Holy Spirit. And I want, as we pause here on the verge of Christmastide, roughly halfway through our exploration together, to clarify how this way of approaching things is anything but that nihilistic, solipsistic, consumeristic vision of the good life I've just described. So when we started this series in September, Miroslav Volf situated our exploration in the context of nothing less than the story of, well, everything. That is, it was the story of God's dealing with the world He has purposed to share in nothing less than His own joy and glory. As this comes to fruition in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, who is God in the flesh. There are a couple of key points from Miroslav's talk that are worth recalling right now as we wrap up the fall and prepare for the second half of our program year. The first of which is that God cares about the world. You would think you could presuppose that as a Christian, but actually I want to suggest it's actually much trickier than we might think. We can't take it quite as for granted as you think you could. God cares about the world. That is, the world is the great enterprise of the one and only triune God. And the lives lived here by God's creatures are the objects of God's loving concern. The world is not a holding chamber, that is, in which human beings have to do time before escaping to the lovelier landscapes of heaven. And think about how easy it is to tell the Christian story or to hear it in just that way. There were early Christians, actually, who thought as much. And over time, the church recognized their beliefs as heretical or dangerous, and for good reason. I had a confirmand recently remark in class that Christianity seemed to promote suicide. Now, if you can get over the shock of that statement, as I had to in order to answer this 8th grader, hear the 8th grader out. Christianity seemed to promote suicide because if heaven is so wonderful and life here is so terrible, why shouldn't we just get on with it and go on and be with God? Good question. And there are ways that Christians have told the story of everything that trend in just that direction, even if they shy away from the candor of my clever 8th grader. One of Miroslav's most important points is that this is not actually a genuine and authentic Christian way of looking at things. Not because of something we have to say about suicide, because of what we have to say about the world and about life in it. The first chapter of Genesis says very clearly that God looks upon the world, and lo, it was not only good, it was very good. And the point of Christian convictions about the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come is not that this world is so terrible so we can escape to a better one, but rather that God is so enamored with and committed to the life of this world that God guarantees it in perpetuity, notwithstanding this world's best efforts to wreck it. That's the story of the Bible, it seems to me. Which leads me to the second major point Miroslav made in his talk, that the story of sin and redemption, the fall and our salvation, is a subplot, as it were, of a much more primary story. The primary story is that God creates the world and then consummates it, as it were, by giving the world a share in God's own life, God's own glory and joy. Christians often talk as though all the Bible has to say is how sinful and bad we are, and how great the lengths were to which God had to go to save us from how bad we are. And that's certainly there, okay? It's part of the story. It's a crucial part even, but it's not all of it. And it's a subplot in the context of this much greater narrative. If you leave the matter there, just with our sin and redemption, if that's all that you ever think about, you could miss the whole point of why God goes to such lengths as incarnation, that is, becoming a part of the fallen creation itself, a particular first-century human being living in the backwater of a great ancient empire in order to save it. The point of all that is not to settle the score of our sin, or not simply to do so. The point is to achieve the end and the goal for which God created the world to begin with, namely that we be fully alive in communion with Him. God doesn't intend our life in this world to be miserable. I feel like we have to put that on a bumper sticker or a business card that we can hand out. God intends all God's creatures to flourish and to share in His own loving delight in all of His works. And if our lives are miserable, and all lives are miserable to some extent, some to greater extent, some to lesser, that misery is due not so much to God's loving purposes for creation, but to sin and its mysterious consequences, summed up in the last enemy to be destroyed, according to St. Paul, which is death. And the good news is that even that misery can be repurposed by God through the mystery of the cross to our own good and to the world's in the fullness of time. One of the things that we hope for during the season of Advent. So the premise behind Fully Alive has been that God intends human beings to flourish, not to be miserable, and that our flourishing is to God's own glory as our Creator, Redeemer, and Consummator. And in my talk, I explained that our route to being fully alive is complicated by the fact that we live not in the world as God originally intended it, but in a world that has freely deviated course through sin and all that sin brings in its wake. That is, we're faced with the question of how to be fully alive in a world that isn't fully alive. As such, as creatures who are sinful, who are fallen, as it were, we can't always expect, I said, to know what will make us fully alive in advance. We have very good reason indeed to suspect our own intuitions in this regard, so far as they've been wrecked by our fall. Or whether we happen to think we found our bliss in stalking an ex-lover, or something more polite than that, like simply relishing negative gossip about them. Neither can we expect to be able to do what will make us fully alive under our own steam, without God's grace. That is, neither can we expect that doing what will make us fully alive will always feel good. It won't. In Jesus, we have solutions to both of these challenges. His life and his teachings give us a pattern to follow through life in a compromised creation, and living relationship and communion with him gives us the power to do so faithfully. He himself, his Spirit, is the means by which we can live a life like his. That's the way that I ended my talk. And we can live a life like his by the power of his Spirit that befits the particular time and place and callings that we each have. And we should accordingly not expect for all of us to look like Jesus in exactly the same way. And that's part of what's up with the theology of the body of Christ that St. Paul is so concerned with throughout all of his letters. As he puts it in Ephesians, there is one body and one Spirit, but grace given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. That's the Christian version of you do you. Or maybe better, you be you. That is, be who God really created you to be in Christ. No one of us is sufficient to the task of imaging Christ to the full. That's not actually the point of any of God's intentions at all. Rather, it takes all of us, indeed all of humanity and all of creation, fully to image who Christ is. According to Colossians, the image of the invisible God. The question for each of us is, what is the peculiar and particular way in which you, are intended by God to be like God, according to the pattern and power of Jesus? Pursuing the peculiar and particular Christ-likeness to which I am called in every part of my life. In other words, following Jesus. That's it. Following Jesus is how I find my bliss. Following Jesus is how we become fully alive. That's what we spent 4 months trying to work out. This fall, we've cut this massive idea down to size by applying it to 5 particular parts of life: family, money, race, and diversity, and work. And also, for lack of a better word, spirituality. There's no great word for what we were doing the last 2 weeks. We were calling it the active and the contemplative life, but maybe we should say it's like what normally goes by the name of spirituality. Even though the premise of this whole thing has been that your spiritual life is your whole life and not just the little bit of it that you might spend in the morning praying, even though that's a crucial part of the rest of it. So first, Ryan McAnally Lynn spoke about how though there is no normative Christian family structure given to us by the Scriptures that can guarantee familial bliss, right? There's no guarantee given to us by the Bible that if you have man, woman, 2.5 kids plus dog, you're going to have familial bliss. It's not in the Bible. But what we do find in Jesus' life and his teaching is the promise that human beings flourish in communities of unconditional love, aka families. That's what a family is ideally supposed to be. And that's an insight which our very own Katie Roach and Jenny Ayers confirmed from their perspective as therapists and counselors from the perspective of attachment theory, or the idea that human beings develop psychologically in healthy ways by forming healthy and lasting bonds or attachments with other humans, preeminently in their families. Then Reverend Elizabeth took us on a deep dive into the Hebrew and Christian scriptures for insights into the life of money, showing how the just distribution and use of money lends both individuals and communities to flourish as we partake in good ways in creation's abundance. Then we heard from the amazing Kathleen Corbett, Brian Hetherington, and Steve Roach as they shared how their own pursuit of Christ has affected and shaped their lives in the financial industry, and gave us insights into how capital flows at global, corporate, and individual levels. The question we were left with being, how can money flow to the glory of God? Then we spent 3 incredible weeks talking about how God creates all creatures to live in communities, or ecosystems, as it were, of diversity, and how it is only through the combination of all the many uniquenesses and differences of creation that we can together image the one God, which was one of the points made so beautifully by Reverend Elizabeth in her presentation, and then fleshed out concretely with regard to one particular difference in American society today, that is race. In a most moving retrospective by Tom Jones, and an amazing teach-in on race and how we can all become more anti-racist in our lives and communities by Lise Least. All of which tied in with our transformative New Canaan Dinner series led by Lise and Deacon Kyle Peterson. Then we had Matt Crosman, who came and spoke about what it meant to work in the power of Christ's Spirit, conceiving of work as bringing to life potentials laden in God's good creation by exercising our own God-given capacities for creativity. drawing those potentials out. Capacities that, in order fully to flourish, need to be bounded, actually, by regular periods of rest and rejuvenation, that is, by Sabbath. Then in a beautiful reflection, Nora Gallagher testified, I thought, to the incredible power of aligning one's work with one's calling or vocation. That is, to the peculiar way that God has called you to participate in Christ's restoration of the world. Something she was able to find in corporate America at Patagonia, notwithstanding her primary identification as a writer. And over the last 2 weeks, having spent the rest of the fall discussing the spirituality of everyday life, we talked about ordinary spirituality, as it were, or what goes regularly by that name. The patterns of prayer and practice by which we make space and time to attend to God amidst the rest of our lives, in the hope that the rest of our lives will take on some of the same shape and color as our prayer lives. A process which Bishop Griswold spoke to most beautifully during his quiet day, then on Sunday morning with particular reference to Mary and Martha, Jesus' friends, in which the three amigos, or the three stooges, if you like, spoke to last week from our own experience. In each of these explorations, I hope that you found something to spur you on towards some new way of thinking about this particular part of your life. And that hopefully you found this new idea about this particular part of your life as having something with which Jesus has to do. Because Jesus has to do with your entire life and not just a little bit of it. And I hope that you were inspired to pursue Him more deeply here, and in doing so to find just a little more of that strange bliss that comes in following Him. We have much more to come up in the spring, as I said. Sex, society, play, digital life, the body, food, suffering, the earth, giving, aging, and death. I mean, we're not even really halfway through. And I hope you'll continue to be a part, and that you'll invite somebody to come with you, or that you'll share these materials online. And I'm going to tell you why. Because I really believe that our world is hungry for bliss. That we all long to be fully alive. And we're here because we believe Jesus is the means to do so. That's why we're here. We often talk as though believing in God is first and foremost a matter of knowledge, as though God was an intellectual problem or exercise, one that's been thrown into doubt through revolutions in science, technology, and so on. And that because of those revolutions in science and technology, all of a sudden churches are empty, because God is somehow less intellectually plausible than God was in the 15th century. I'm not sure any of that's true. I think that above all, believing in God is first and foremost about finding God beautiful and worthy of our desire and attention. It's about finding Jesus attractive and finding His story and the stories of all those whose lives have been transformed by His compelling. If the church has a problem, it's that one. This is a massive challenge, perhaps the massive challenge for us today. It's the same one that Fred Rogers gave all of us, to make goodness attractive in our lifetimes. And I hope that we have done so this fall. That's what this whole series is actually about, making goodness in Christ attractive. Not only through the ideas that we've shared, but the lives that we've shared. Miroslav's and Ryan's and Katie's and Jenny's and Kathleen's and Brian's and Steve's and Tom's and Lisa's and Nora's and Frank's and Peter's and Elizabeth's and maybe even somehow mine. We did so in an effort to communicate the good news. The easiest way of doing so is simply to put on display the gentle splendor of the people of God, which is how you show people Jesus. We can't wait to get going again in January. So, that's the wrap-up. I wonder if anybody has a question about something I've just said, or a reflection, or a question that came up somewhere along the lines of September, or a reflection on how participating in this series has affected you or moved in your life. Anything in any of those arenas.
Justin, this is from last week. You said something that I've been thinking about all week, and perhaps you'd like to share it with us. You said that you had gone to a hospital to see some parishioner who was ill, and you had planned to say something to that person, but you couldn't do it. because you underwent some kind of a change, and that change hadn't changed since you'd been to the hospital. Can you share what it was that you felt?
I certainly can. The conversation that I had with this person was about whether or not God was testing them by requiring them, as it were, to undergo this particular trial. And I would say that I was working with a theology that I had learned in school, one that made a lot of intellectual sense. And the most consistent thing to say with that theology was, yes, God is testing you. And I couldn't say it. I couldn't say it. And so then that meant that all the rest of my theology, since it couldn't follow, I had to reboot the whole rest of my theology, which I'm still doing. I had an understanding of that maybe God wanted us to be a little more miserable than I suggested in the talk I just gave. That maybe sometimes being miserable was good for us pedagogically or something like that. God was trying to teach us lessons or something. It just doesn't work. Doesn't work. It's not true. It's not true. And it also goes against the grain of what most of the Christian story is about, which is the fact that God is trying to do something to fix all of the miserable states that we live in.
On the other hand, there is a long tradition of awareness and acceptance of the fact that God does test us. And so we've got a matter of discernment on our hands. How do we know when we are being tested or not? How do we know whether to expect God's mercy or not?
Oof. Yeah, so to put this in the context of the talk, when is it that under the conditions of this present world, might we be required to live under situations of strain or stress? Maybe they weren't God's ideal plan, but maybe they're God's contingency plan, given that we live in this world and not in the Garden of Eden or whatever. I still shy away from the idea that God is directly testing us, as though God is sitting up there and then decides, you know what, it's this person has not had enough suffering in their life, and so boom, I'm going to see if that happens. Which is one of the ways you could read the story of Job, right? You could read the story of Job as though, it's God and the devil, and they're sitting up in some great conference room, and then they're looking down, and boom, there we go. Job needs some suffering. I'll send the suffering to Job. You could also read Job as a story of life happens to Job, as life happens to all of us. I mean, none of us are getting out of this thing alive, and I meant what I said. All our lives are miserable to greater or lesser extents, okay? I've not met anybody with no misery whatsoever. And that the book, you could read the book of Job as an attempt on Job's part to make sense of the suffering that came upon Job in a kind of retrospective way, to look back on it and to try and find something that God might achieve through it, some way that God might use it actually for His own good. And I do think that actually that's the way that God relates to our misery much of the time. Not that God sends the misery, but that God can repurpose it, refashion it, make clever and ingenious use of it in order to make it good and meaningful to us. I tend to think that suffering is meaningless on its own most of the time. It's just, bad things just happen. They don't happen for a reason. They just happen. The miracle of the cross is that somehow God is ingenious enough and resourceful enough to make even the meaningless parts of our lives meaningful. And that's one of my hopes for the life of the world to come. I don't think it always happens on this side of heaven. Some people are capable actually of articulating the meaning that God gives to the meaninglessness parts of their life in this life. I mean, many of you are extraordinary in this regard. The conversations that we have with you are incredible, because you come out with oh my gosh, I have grown through my cancer in X, Y, or Z ways, and I would never give it up. And I'm like, whoa, what? Really? That doesn't happen for everybody. My hope is that from the vantage point of eternity, God will be able to show us the ways that God has been secretly, quietly working for our good in the midst of all of it. That doesn't mean, though, that God sent the cancer. And so I think that our theology of what it means for something to be a trial actually needs to change. It's not God sending it. It could be God using what, in some mysterious way, just happens. Because the world's genuinely distinct from God. God is really serious about being a creator. God creates something that's really different from God. And maybe something which is not entirely under God's control. I think I want to own that statement. Anyway, that's this is why I was saying last week, Mary, my theology is in process here. I would have never, ever said that 3 years ago. Certainly wouldn't have said it before I was a priest. Wouldn't have said it before I went full-time here either. But I think that's what I think is true today, and I might think something different tomorrow. Eric.
I agree with where you are now.
That's good.
I think
Eric will still be here tomorrow.
I think for us to say God is testing me is tantamount to saying he is a puppeteer and has strings and he's doing everything and making good, making bad, or whatever. The world is a broken and sinful place. The world is broken. God fixes the world through the relationships that we have with Jesus and with one another. God, and people say, was it God's will that so-and-so got cancer? Was it God's will that... No, I mean, God did not want that to happen. But it happened under his sovereignty. So in a sense, everything that ever happened any time is God's will. You can say that. But that does not attribute to God the intention or the desire for those things to have happened. So I get really frustrated with the "is God testing me?" question, because life tests me.
Yeah, that's good.
God gives me a way to get through the test.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Cindy here in the back, Rick.
Yeah, you're not going to like this, but I'm going to come back to my question that I asked Miroslav because I think this so plays into it.
Yep.
So, and Job has been bothering me for weeks.
Yep.
I just heard it this time. So if God knew that this was going to happen because God is God, why did he give us free will?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So is your suggestion that God
could have run this in a different way?
Yeah.
He could have, if he's God, he knew how this would play out, and he knows everything. And so he must have looked at this and said, oh, wow, that's not a good path. This is going to be messy and, whatever. I mean, so that is just the question. At that moment, what in your mind is the reason that he said, I'm going to let these guys run with it, and I'm going to try to send comfort and grace and on the back end?
Yeah. Thank you for that, Cindy. I want to say first, I just really appreciate your candor and the honesty of your question. I remember it when you asked Miroslav, and I'm thankful for it now too. Most of us are too afraid to ask questions of that sort in exactly the honest, with exactly the kind of candor that you're asking it. It's exactly what Job does. Okay, Job is just as candid. He's not pulling any punches there with God. I have to say, I don't know the reason, and I think that anybody who speculates too much about the reason verges on obscenity. Not to mention just straight up lying. I don't think we actually know the reason. I do believe, not every theologian believes, but I do believe that one day we will be given the reason, or we will have some sort of an awareness of the reason. It's one of the things that I hope for when we see God face to face, when we see Jesus face to face. But I don't think that we know the reason here. There are reasons why that theologians have given throughout the ages, and all of them are insufficient to my mind. I mean, these reasons run the gamut from well, we just deserve everything that happens to us because of the way that we have sinned. That worked for a little while. It really doesn't work after the Holocaust. And so you don't find basically anybody after the mid-20th century giving that reason anymore, because there are just some sufferings and evils which are so abhorrent that you can't actually, they're like, okay, there's something disproportionate then about the punishment if this is all, just to punish us. Some people think that even an early church father named Origen thinks it's basically to teach us a lesson. That we will eventually wisen up through suffering. It's kind of like, the way you might let a kid touch the stove in order so that, they eventually learn for themselves that it's hot after you warn them over and over and over again, and then they keep going after it, and you're like, okay, whatever. It's kind of like the story of the prodigal son. Maybe you just let creation go off on its own to just teach them a lesson, suffer the consequences of their actions, and then they'll be grateful for God, the parent, as it were, on their way back. But I think that's too trite, too. It's all of these solutions, any reason you can give for why this is so, it ends up making light of the awfulness of the suffering that's really faced in our world. And so I think that it's Christians' job not to give an answer, and to not give an answer as eloquently as possible. And it's not just me trying to find an escape route because I'm not smart enough to come up with the answer. It's because I think that any giving of an answer is going to downplay the awfulness and abhorrence of the suffering that people actually face, which is, I think it's an answer only God can give us, because God is the only one qualified to do so. The only inkling that we get of it is the cross. That's it. Which is not so much a statement as a solution. Jean.
So I have two things. One is in connection with the issue around happiness, and that it was something that became very apparent to me at a particular time, and I said, okay, every book that said happiness, and the one that really made sense was one called Stumbling on Happiness, and I actually had the good fortune to listen to this man give his speech, and that so many people, I think, confuse happiness and pleasure, and that they also think, oh, one more thing and I solve it, life will be good, and that it's a continuous process. And that brought great comfort and understanding in people who seem to bring troubles onto their lives. But this issue of the world searching for spirituality has, I find, so striking in how many national corporations are now embedding into their national meetings a part of it on mindfulness, spiritual type things, from Brene Brown, who's called upon to be a major part of a program, to locally, I know people who are in this field as some kind of therapists are called to local meetings. So I think that the world is crying out for this, to more of this that you're doing.
Totally,
here.
absolutely. Not just what I'm doing.
No,
what
but
we're
I mean
doing.
this
Thank you.
program. Yes, right, yes. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have a little bit to say about the way that the world's crying out about it, but I'm actually going to pass that by, because Father Peter is much more eloquent about mindfulness vis-a-vis some of these things than I am. I love the title of that book, Stumbling
Stumbling on happiness.
on
right,
happiness.
yes.
Because I think that's often how we find our bliss as Christians. It's in accidental places where we don't expect to find any life, but then we do. There was a version of my talk that ended with a poem that I got off of Lynn Donohue's Christmas card. If you've ever been so fortunate as to receive a Christmas card from Jack and Lynn Donohue, you know they're incredibly beautiful. Lynn designs them by hand, and each year they feature a quote. This year's was from Mary Oliver's, this is a paraphrase, but it's something like, when you find joy, stop and enjoy it. And in the context of the poem, Oliver is saying that, there are these moments where, the world can be an incredibly awful and hard place. Life here is not easy. But we occasionally find little glimpses of joy. And when you do, don't just shirk it off as though, I guess I must have had too much caffeine this morning or something like that. Pay attention to it, attend to it, and then follow it. And that's as Christian a conviction, I think, as I know.
Well, on the way here today, there was a TED Talk, about TED Talks and a summation, and the man is retiring from the show, and they asked him to say what was the most memorable, and it was actually Elizabeth, what's her name, that wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and she said, not
Gilbert.
follow your bliss, but follow your curiosity will lead to interesting, happiness in unexpected things, being vulnerable.
Beautiful.
Uh-huh.
Beautiful. Anyone else? There in the back, Mr. Pike.
Justin, what if we're just put here to work things out for ourselves? And is that consistent with Christian belief? If we just work things out for ourselves, and that's part of the human condition?
I would say it's part of Christian belief, as I understand it, with two disclaimers. The first is that you can only figure it out with God's help. That's why if you think about our baptismal service, all of those vows end with God's help. I will with God's help. I will with God's help. Very rare in the church that you find a vow that you take in a liturgy that just says I will. For some reason, they're all over the marriage liturgy, which we might want to change. We say I will and I do, and anyway, without saying with God's help there. I need God's help. Certainly Jewel does. I'm hard to live with. Anyway, but in most of the other liturgies, it's always I will with God's help. And so that is a Christian conviction that you can't actually work any of this stuff out without God's help. That is a Christian conviction. The other one is, the other disclaimer I would put on is that we're not meant to work it out alone. That's been becoming increasingly clear to me, particularly since after leaving the ivory tower, as it were, where it's really it's the alone communing with the alone. Each of us in our little library silos, like monks, no, we're actually much more alone than the monks. It's a problem. We're not meant to do it alone. And this is that Christian version of you do you that I was trying to describe. None of us are supposed to work it out, figure it out by ourselves, which is why we are. Which is why we have a body, which is why we have a community, not just in a spiritual sense, but in the sense that you all came to church today to be with one another, and not just to listen to somebody to rattle on about God. But speaking of the rattling on, the bell tolls. We will see you in January. First up is Allison Grusecki kicking off an entire month of January with a one-week interruption, not an interruption, but a hiatus, to speak about Martin Luther King Jr.'s theology of human flourishing and society, a society that flourishes. But otherwise, all of January is about sex. So invite your friends to Sex Month at St. Mark's.